Hello, everyone. Welcome to the weekly dose of neuroscience. And this week, we're going to be talking about exactly what we're looking at right now, these crazy complex structures. And often you might have seen it. If you've never seen this before, you might be able to look back on television shows or maybe movies where someone might be in deep thought or might have taken some sort of drug enhancement that enhances the neuronal activity or your brain activity, because they'll zoom in on a person's brain and you'll see these crazy complex structures with these lights like flashing everywhere, moving from one area to another, and just this crazy complex thing that's happening. And I just want to be able to break it down and talk about what is actually going on, because this happens in all of us and we wouldn't be able to function without it. And it happens 24/7, no matter whether we are awake or we're asleep or doing any activity. It is these crazy complex things are happening 24/7. And these individual things are called neurons, and they make up our nervous system, which our central nervous system consists of our brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is basically every other nerve that isn't the spinal cord and in the brain. So, what even is a neuron? Well, there's not a very concrete definition to what a neuron is, because it's one of those things where you know it when you see it. But there is something that we can all agree on, which is it is a subunit of the nervous system. Something such as the brain has millions upon millions of different kinds of neurons that perform different things, and it allows us to function. But we do need to talk about some of the basic structures of a neuron, which allows it to function. The first is going to be the dendrites. There's going to be some sort of stimulus that interacts with these branches called the dendrites, and this will allow a signal to be sent into the soma, which is this big structure right here. And the signal will eventually reach this axon hillock right here. And the axon hillock is basically a trigger for the neuron. You can think of it as a trigger, because the axon hillock, which isn't clearly shown in this picture of a neuron, but it's a trigger where once you can think of it as when you pull the trigger, it causes a gun to fire. In this case, you pull the trigger and it causes the neuron to fire, and the signal will be rapidly sent from one end of the neuron to the other, and it allows information to be sent through the neuron, and it allows it to ultimately release neurotransmitters. But we'll talk about that later. Next, we have the axon, which is basically this long neck or tube or whatever you want to call it, which allows the signal to be sent from one end of the neuron to the other. And then we also have the terminal boutons. And these terminal boutons, which are these branches, release the signal so that another structure, whether it be a neuron or another muscle. In this case, we're just going to talk about neuron to another neuron. But in these terminal boutons would release a signal so that another neuron's dendrites will pick up the signal, and then it will transfer its signal down the line. And it's this chain reaction, basically, which we can see in the bottom right photo, which shows one neuron's terminal bouton interacting and sending signals to another neuron's dendrites. But how does this all work? So, like I said, you start off with a stimulus, and this stimulus can be a multitude of things. It could be something a physical stimulus, such as you pressing on your arm or part of your body, and you are able to perceive the pressure that you're putting on it. What happens is that the neurons will fire, and it'll basically go all the way to your spinal cord, all the way to your brain, so that you can perceive it. These stimuli or these different stimulus could be a chemical or maybe even an electrical signal or stimulus. And in this case, we're just going to generalize it as a stimulus because it all kind of depends on where in the body it is. So this stimulus will, like I said, interact with the dendrites of the neuron. And however it interacts with it, whether it's a physical, chemical, or electrical, physical, or electric um, interaction, they interact differently, but the result is still the same, which channels will open up and it will allow, well, I'll put in blue, sodium to come into the soma. And what happens with the sodium is we can see that there is a positive charge. It is Na plus and it has a positive charge. And when it goes into the soma, it'll naturally diffuse down to the axon hillock, which is right here. And the axon hillock will then fire because once again, it is the trigger, and it'll send the signal down the axon, ultimately to the terminal boutons that are right here and shown in this big circle. And the terminal boutons will release the signal to another neuron's terminal or dendrites, another neuron's dendrites, so that the signal can then be sent down, or sodium can be sent in and sent down the axon, ultimately going down the axon to the terminal boutons, then to the next neuron, and so forth. But how does a stimulus even create an action potential? Because the action potential is when you are sending the signal from one end to the other end, because something has to happen, the neuron has to fire. So the stimulus, once again, is going to interact with the terminal boutons. The sodium will rush in. Sorry, my pen is acting up a little bit, and will come into the soma, increasing the concentration of sodium in there. It will then reach the axon hillock right here. Once this positive charge reaches the axon hillock, more sodium is going to come in to the neuron. And then as it goes down, as this positive charge goes, it diffuses down the axon, there's going to be these voltage gates, which I will indicate in orange. There'll be a bunch of voltage gates throughout the axon that once the positive signal reaches these voltage gates, more sodium will rush into the neuron. And this is an action potential. When the sodium rushes in and you're carrying the positive charge down from one end to the neuron to the other end, all the way until it gets to the terminal boutons. And as we can see, this to the left is right here is a oscilloscope. And this allows us to record the electrical activity going on in a neuron. And it's very helpful to see what is going on in the neuron, because what we see is that it increases in charge and then it decreases. And so this is very interesting because, as we know, let me get a different color. As we know, the sodium when it rushes in, sorry, this is sodium. When it rushes in, it's going to be increasing the charge. But then how does it go down? That doesn't quite make sense, right? Because if you keep adding positive charges into it, how does it decrease in charge? Because if we if only sodium rushes in, theoretically, we would flatline at here. And this would be very bad because this means that eventually, or we're going to be just releasing so much information, and we don't want that. We would not want that. There's going to be many problems that come with this. If this happens, there's a lot of problems if you don't have enough neurons or have too many neurons. There's a bunch of different things that could go wrong when it comes to neurons, which is what I'm going to be explaining in future videos. But how does this happen? Well, when we're at -70, we are at resting potential. This is the potential or the net electric potential of the neuron at baseline, where there's nothing interacting with it. Sodium hasn't been coming in, and this is at -70. Once there's some sort of stimulus sending sodium into the neuron, the signal will start going up. And once it reaches threshold, which we can see right here, once it reaches threshold, which is -55, and it reaches the axon hillock at -55, the axon hillock will pull the trigger and fire and open its voltage gates, allowing sodium to rush in. And tons of sodium is going to be rushing in because there's tons of sodium outside the neuron. And so it'll naturally diffuse into the neuron when the gates open. And this will rapidly cause it to increase in charge to +30. And once it reaches +30, something has to happen to stop this sodium from coming in. Otherwise, we will continue to go up. Whoa, sorry about that. Don't know what happened there. So something has to happen at +30 to stop the sodium from coming in. And once it reaches +30 right here, these voltage gates that allow the sodium to rush in, they close because they are voltage dependent. So once they open at -55, but they also close at +30. So when that happens, sodium is no longer rushing in, and so it stops the positive charge from continuing to increase. Now, there's something else that happens. Let me just erase everything to clear up some room. There's another ion that plays a role in action potentials, and you might have already seen it right here. The potassium ions leave the neuron. And you might be wondering why. Because if sodium is rushing into the neuron, why would potassium be leaving? Well, similar to how there's a high concentration of sodium outside the neuron, well, there's a high concentration of potassium in the neuron. And just so you guys are aware, potassium carries a positive charge as well. And so when potassium leaves the neuron, it will cause the charge to decrease. But at +30, similar to how there is voltage gates throughout the axon for sodium, there's voltage gates for potassium as well. But just like how I mentioned, how potassium leaves, well, when these voltage gates open for potassium, potassium will rapidly diffuse out out of the neuron, decreasing this charge. And it'll eventually reach hyperpolarization because it these potassium channels don't start to close immediately once it reaches resting potential. It takes a little bit of time before they all close, which is why we reach hyperpolarization. And hyperpolarization is just when we are below the resting potential of a neuron. But then, if most of you guys might have been looking, we can see that it goes back up and goes back to its resting state. So how does this happen? Well, fortunately, we have things in our body such as potassium or sodium potassium pumps, which will pump in uh, the potassium back into the neuron and sodium out of the neuron. So it will balance it out so that it will return back to its resting potential and allow us to send a signal. And once an action potential happens, these terminal boutons will release neurotransmitters, which we can see in this image right here, where these vesicles carrying neurotransmitters will release its neurotransmitters into the system or into the synaptic cleft, which is just the area between one neuron and another neuron. And it'll bind to the receptors, allowing the signal to enter the second neuron and pretty much repeat the cycle. So why is this even important? Well, the biggest thing is neurons are throughout our whole entire body, and it allows us to do basically everything and to survive. And it allows us to move our muscles and just move around, breathe. It allows us to do basically everything to keep us alive. Without neurons, we couldn't do anything. It also allows us to have thoughts and personalities and all of these crazy complex things that come with being a human and one human being different to another one. And similar to that, it makes you you because you are different from the person right next to you or your friend or family member. Everyone has their differences, and although you can contribute it to genetics, the neurons are what makes up who we are. And even though they all fire the same way between one person and another, they cause us to have different characteristics between one person to another, where one person might be more optimistic, where another one's more pessimistic. And it can also cause a lot of problems and diseases and such, which I will discuss in the future videos. And I just want to thank you guys for listening to my video. If you guys have any suggestions or if you guys want to hear any topics about neuroscience, they are always welcome. Just leave it in the comments. And just as a reminder, new videos weekly. I will be posting every Sunday. So thank you guys, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.